Thanks Neil for that nice introduction, and thank you Siddharth and Anand for organizing a really cool workshop and for inviting me. Thank you all for being here. So I'm going to talk to you about non-malleable encodings and their applications. The talk will be based mostly on my joint work with Sai Lakshmi, Bhavana, Obbattu and Shruti Sekar. Shruti is here, say hi. And towards the end I'll touch upon some work that we've recently done with Ishan Chattopadhyay. Okay, so most of the talks on crypto will pertain to cool stuff happening in the crypto bazaar, where we're selling all sorts of cool stuff. We're selling encryption schemes, signatures, authentication, and you know what? The coolest thing of all, blockchain. So you can do all of these amazing things, right? And it's really great. But when you go home and open the box, you'll see that conditions apply, because for security guarantee, you have to store the secret key in a safe vault. Okay, that's a bit of an exaggeration, but it's not completely far-fetched. And in particular, it is true that most of the cryptography that you see out there, you really need the secret key to be stored securely, where the adversary who you're trying to protect the system from doesn't have information about the secret key. The secret key is not tampered. You're actually implicitly making a lot of assumptions about how your secret keys are stored. And this is all very well, but ideally we'd like to minimize these assumptions. And specifically, I'm going to give you an example of a flavor of attacks that we'll want to protect against, and those are called related key attacks. What is a related key attack? Now let's consider the example of a digital signature scheme, where you have a key K that's used to generate signatures, and your security guarantee is that the adversary cannot forge signatures. So the adversary gets to observe input-output behavior, namely signatures on messages of his choice, and then needs to come up with something called a forgery, basically come up with a signature on a new message. And standard signatures will guarantee that the adversary cannot actually do it. Now, what happens if there is an adversary that's tampering with the secret key? If the adversary tampers with the secret key and changes it to some K prime, and then observes input-output behavior, that could potentially be a lot more harmful. And specifically, related key attacks pertain to this model, where the adversary changes the secret key to something related and then observes signatures on K prime. You could define related key attacks for any primitive. For digital signatures, this is the model, but you could observe input-output behavior on any primitive. And in such a case, it would actually, you could come up with concocted schemes where it would be possible to forge signatures on the underlying secret key K. And this is something that you want to prevent. So this is, a use case that we want to take care of. And for this, we'll use something called non-malleable codes. But before we talk about non-malleable codes, what are regular codes? They have an encoding function and a decoding function, and they have a correctness guarantee. The encoder takes the message and outputs a code word, and the correctness will tell you that if you decode a correct code word, you will recover your original message, right? So this is just simple codes. And what non-malleability tells you is that you can prevent related tampering of the underlying message even under adversarial modification of the code word. We'll take a look at what we mean by this. So non-malleable codes were introduced by Zimbowski, Peterjak and Wicks in IISc 2010, and they're actually a very cool primitive, quite fascinating, and so that's what we're going to talk about today. Okay, so what is this game? So when an adversary is tampering the code word, you can modify C to some C prime, and now the decoder is going to decode C prime and recover M prime, right? And what happens now? It would be great if we could say that M prime is always going to be equal to M, but that's not necessarily going to be true. What non-malleability guarantees is that even if we don't have this guarantee that M prime is equal to M, at the very least we can say that it's independent of M. And that's extremely important for cryptography, because if you think about, message as being the secret key, you don't mind if the adversary learns information about independent secret keys, because that is something that the adversary could generate on her own. What you don't want the adversary to learn is information about the secret key or something related to the secret key. And therefore, this is a very useful guarantee from a cryptographic point of view. One thing I have to mention is that non-malleable codes are defined with respect to a family of functions, because it's impossible to build them for all class of functions, and we'll talk a little bit about this family of functions as well. So why is it useful to have this property? Let's go back to the digital signature and see what happens. If instead of storing your key directly, you store a code word, now the adversary, that's tampering the system will end up tampering this code word, and you can modify, the adversary can modify C to C prime, and when you decode, you recover a K prime. And what happens after that? You know that non-malleability is going to tell you that K prime is independent of K, and because it's independent of K, a related key attack is no longer going to be possible. Now, the fact that this doesn't, that related key attack is not possible, it's intuitively true. I'm not going to get into the details of why it's true, but the concept is that you're securing your system with respect to one key. So all of the information obtained about something that's completely independent can't affect the security of the system that you're trying to build. That's the high level idea. Basically your corruption is sort of oblivious. You don't read C and then it's information will basically get to what, it doesn't even see, corrupt the entire code word. There is a model of tampering function, so I'll get to exactly how it can corrupt it. Okay, so a related key attack is not going to be possible, and that's essentially what we want to use. Yes. So this notion of non-malleability is not new. It's not something that came up with non-malleable codes. It's been very well studied, and it's actually very challenging to define non-malleability per se. So I'm not going to define it, but you use some notion of simulation. You use a simulation paradigm to actually define it. For those of you who are familiar with it, I'm not ever going to, in this talk, I'm not going to define non-malleability formally at all. But the concept is at a high level. What is independence? Independence essentially says that anything that the adversary could have done with the message, the adversary could have learned that same information when that message was not present. So that's the idea. Okay, and because we're talking primarily about, at least in this talk, about non-malleable codes for cryptographic keys, we'll talk about something called non-malleable randomness encoders, which is joint work with Shruti and Bhavana, my student Bhavana. Like non-malleable codes, there's an encoder and there's a decoder. The non-malleability guarantee is the following. So if you look at the encoder for a non-malleable randomness encoder, the input is essentially this randomness R, and it's going to output the message, which is a key K, a code, a random message K, and a code word C. And this key is guaranteed to be uniform or close to uniform. Now, for a regular non-malleable code, you don't have any of this. The input to the encoder is basically just a message. So you take a message and you output a code word. Here you're actually looking at a different problem. You have a randomness, and the randomness is used to generate the message, which is the key, as well as the code word corresponding to the key. And then there's a corresponding decoder, which is going to do the following. It's going to take a code word, even a potentially tampered code word, and it's going to output K prime, and you have a guarantee again that either K prime is the same as K or it's completely independent of K. Any questions on what we're setting out to do? So just to recap, in a non-malleable randomness encoder, you have to generate two things. You first have to generate your random message, and then you have to generate an encoding of that random message. The adversary gets to tamper only the code word, he gets to tamper only C, and you want to guarantee on the underlying, on the security of the underlying key that was originally encoded, right? Okay, so that's a non-malleable randomness encoder. For NMCs and NMREs, there are two main parameters that we're going to try and optimize. The first is the tampering family with respect to which we can secure it, and the other is rate, as it is for any coding scheme. And what is the tampering family that we're going to consider? We'll consider something called the T-split state family, where the code word consists of a set of chunks, blocks of code word, and the adversary can tamper each of these blocks with some adversarially specified function independently. So basically the adversary, so if you're talking about a two split state family, the code word will consist of two blocks, C1 and C2. The adversary can specify F1 and F2 to tamper each of these CIs independently, and you essentially cannot, when you're deciding what tampering function to use, you don't really know. This is an information theoretic guarantee, so it's each of these FIs could be arbitrary, but you're preventing any interdependence between the code words, between the tampering functions. Okay, so this is a very general model, and the reason why it's useful is because now when you look at how the secret keys are stored, you can assume, you have to make a slightly less stringent assumption, which is that the secret key is stored in two different storage systems which are not going to be tampered in an interdependent manner. So you just need that amount of independence. Okay. The next parameter, this I have to mention. The lower the value of T, the more powerful the adversary. That's natural, right? Because the adversary gets to observe more information while tampering it. So you're, if you assume that you have a lot of chunks that can be tampered only independently, that's actually a weaker assumption, right? So you want to lower the value of T. Now, can you do a value of T equals 1? You can't, because there are no secret keys. The adversary essentially can look at the code word, decode it, and see what the message is, and then come up with the code word of a related message. So you cannot have T is equal to 1. T is equal to 2 is the best possible. Okay. And rate is standard message length over code word length. Again, higher rate corresponds to lower redundancy. So what we want to do is to get a rate that's as high as possible. These are the goals. The holy grail of this area is to build constant rate non-malleable codes for the two split state family. And ever since people have been looking at non-malleable codes, which was I think about close to 8 years ago, people have been trying to build constant rate non-malleable codes while minimizing the number of states. So what is the prior work in this area? So Chiragchi and Guruswamy had a result at IISc 2014, which says that if you have a two-state non-malleable code, the best possible rate that you could hope to achieve is 1 minus 1 over T. And which means that for two states, the best possible rate is that you could hope to achieve is half. And let's take a look at the best known constructions. For the n state non-malleable code, Chiragchi and Guruswamy have a rate 1 construction, so they match what's optimal. And the next best was for 10 states. For 10 states, just based on Chiragchi Guruswamy's result, we know that the best we can do is 9 over 10. All the red bars correspond to the best possible, and the blue bars correspond to the best known results. And Chattopadhyay and Zuckerman and Fox 2014 came up with a constant rate construction. So this was the first construction that was constant rate, constant number of states. So that makes this paper very cool. One problem is that the constants are quite poor. It's asymptotically low, in fact, and therefore we still want to do better. For the two state, the holy grail, of course, is to get a half rate construction. And there Lee has the best known result, which is 1 over log n rate construction. So as you can see, there's a huge gap, and in fact we don't know of any construction for any t less than n with an explicit constant rate. Then in TCC, Shruti, Bhavana and I came up with a 1/3 rate construction for 4 states. And this was the first explicit constant rate construction for t less than n. And there is still a gap. And then we asked the question, non-malleable codes provide a very strong guarantee, which is that for all messages, you have a very nice way of encoding it. So the question we asked is, can we do better if you're looking at random messages? Because in our typical crypto use case, we're talking only about random messages. So we don't really need such a strong guarantee. And that's when we came up with the notion of randomness encoders. And, and we came up with the 3-state construction. For 3-state, the best we could potentially do was 2 by 3. We fall short. We get a 1/3 rate NMC, and this was also independently discovered by Gupta, Maji and Wang. Okay, so this is the current state of art. In the rest of the talk, what I'll try to do is I'll give you a flavor of this half rate NMRE construction for the 2 split state model, and hopefully that will give you a flavor of the sort of ideas that go into some of these things and what are the issues that come up. Won't really give you a very detailed proof sketch, but I'll also talk to you a little bit about potential applications. Okay, so the audience is somewhat mixed, so I'll go slowly. Sorry, yes. Do the bounds apply? I cannot say that it applies up to the constant factor. Obviously, constant rate NMREs is the best possible, but whether rate half is the best, I do not know. And yeah, it may very well be, but I do not know that. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to go a bit slow with all the building blocks. The first building block is a randomness extractor. This basically, you have a source W, which has entropy, and you have a seed which is completely uniform, and it allows you to generate completely uniform bits. What do I mean by entropy? Well, basically, if I have the uniform distribution, if I have 100 bits that are generated uniformly at random, then I have 100 bits of entropy. In that, if I take 10 bits and fix them to the string of all zeros, then I've lost 10 bits of entropy, essentially have 90 bits of entropy. So entropy is essentially a measure of how random your distribution is. So I'm allowed one sample from this distribution with entropy, and I'm allowed to pick a seed uniformly at random, and then my goal is to come up with something that looks uniform. In reality, it will look close to uniform, and we'll use a notion of statistical distance for this, but let's ignore all that. Okay, specifically, we have a strong guarantee on the security of randomness extractors, which says that even given this seed that was chosen uniformly at random, the output of the extractor is going to look close to uniform. And this is going to be quite useful for us. So when I go into the construction of the NMRE, much of what I tell you about is going to be to understand the power of extractors and how they're really going to help us. So if you have any questions about the definition of extractors, I'd be happy to answer them. Okay, so let's move on. The next building block is something called an information theoretic one-time message authentication code. Think of it as an information theoretic variant of a digital signature. To set up notation, I have the following. It's a keyed primitive, so there's a key, authentication key, and there's a message, and it's going to come up with a tag. There is a corresponding verify procedure which takes the key and the message and the tag, and it outputs 0 or 1 depending on whether the verification went through. So in essence, it's a keyed primitive, it's a symmetric primitive. The person who's generating the tag has a key, the same key needs to be used for verification, and you have a guarantee that if the verification went through, then the message was not modified. Sorry. Yeah, so that's pretty much what this is saying, right? Okay, then the other building block that we're going to use is a non-malleable code for the 2 split state model. Now, this, you know what a non-malleable code looks like. It takes a message and it comes up with 2 states L and R. So bear in mind that this is the 2 split state model. So the adversary that's tampering L has no clue about R and vice versa. And one might wonder, we're trying to build NMREs, so what is the whole point of assuming the existence of an NMC? point is that it can be a poor rate NMC, and essentially we're going to show how to amplify to get a better rate NMRE. And we'll specifically use an instantiation due to Lee. Okay, so let's try and recall what a NMRE is. As I said, there's an encoder which has to output two things. One, it has to output a random message, and two, it has to output a code word. Right? So that's the two components of an NMRE. And just as a sanity check, if this is what we want to do, why can't we just pick a message at random, because that's really all we want, and encode it using a standard NMC? That should technically work, and that is correct. It is an NMRE, and the problem is that you're going to be limited by the rate of the underlying NMCs, and you don't know how to build constant rate NMCs in the two split state models, so you're essentially assuming what you can solve when you do this. So what is the main idea? The idea is that you want to generate this randomness not by choosing it at random, because then you don't have too much leverage. Instead, you use some structure to generate the randomness. And specifically how we're going to generate it is to use randomness extractors. Then once we have that structure, can we exploit the structure to non-malleably encode with better rate? That's sort of the flavor of the question we're asking. Okay, so as I said, one component of the NMRE is very simple. You take a source, you take a seed, you're going to come up with the output of an extractor, and that's really all it is. So we need to understand what happens when to the key when W and S are modified. Why do we need to understand this? We need to understand it because it's a non-malleable code. We need to be able to decode and recover K, which means that we need to convey W and S. So when I'm trying to build my NMRE, I have to bear in mind that W and S have to be conveyed, and I have to cleverly convey it to you so that there can't be any malleable tampering, right? So first I want to understand what happens when W and S are just sent as it is and you're modifying it to some W prime and S prime. Now there are a lot of cases that we could consider, but there are two cases which we have a handle on. Specifically, if W prime is related to W but S prime is independent, or if W prime is independent of W. There are two cases where I have a guarantee that K prime, the modified key, is actually completely independent of the underlying key. Now this follows from extractor security. It's easy to see, but just believe me in case you don't see it. Okay, so now the takeaway from this slide is that it's very useful to have an independent, a guarantee that if the seed is tampered, you're tampering it to something that's completely independent. Because if you obtain the extractor output on an independent seed, you're not going to lose security of the original extractor output. Okay, so how do we get independence of the seed? We essentially just encode it using the poor rate non-malleable code. Please bear in mind that the seed is actually very short, and therefore it's okay to do this. And that's why you can actually work with a poor rate non-malleable code. Okay, so now what would the code word be? I need to convey W and I need to convey the seed, so therefore I'm going to have a three-state construction where one state stores the source W, the other two states store the encoding of L and R. And now what happens if there is tampering? Let's see what happens if S prime is independent. If S prime is independent, then you're taken care of because of extractor security. If S prime is related, then we're in trouble because extractor security no longer applies, but still we can actually dig deeper and see how to prevent this. So if the non-malleable, if S prime is related to S, then you know something really useful because this was a non-malleable code. You know that because it's a non-malleable code, the only relation possible is the identity, right? So S prime has to be equal to S. And now the good news is that if you can somehow prevent tampering of W, then you know that your key is the same and you're fine because that's a guarantee that you can live with. You want the key to either be the same or independent, so that's the world you're going to be in, and that's okay, right? But obviously you could tamper W to W prime because that's in a completely sitting all by itself in a state of its own, and the adversary can actually tamper it. And this is a problem. But what we're going to do is we're going to say that whenever W is modified, we will insist somehow through our construction that S is also modified. And again, if S is modified, then bullet 1 is going to be enough to take care of the situation. So that's the game, right? Okay, so how do we ensure this? I'm just going to present the construction as is. The random message generation still remains the same. For sending W, I'm first going to authenticate it by using a MAC. Of course, for this, I'll have to generate a MAC key on my own. So I'll have to eventually convey that as well. We'll get to that. So I'll generate a MAC key. I'm the encoder. I'll generate a MAC key. I'll, sample W. I'll, compute a tag. And now, as the encoder, I have to convey to the decoder this additional MAC key. I have to convey the tag, and so on, right? So what do? I just take Ka, I take S, I take T. Remember, all of these are very short. You can get very good MACs with short keys and short tags. And I convey that by encoding it using a non-malleable code with port rate. So now L and R essentially have all of that information needed for verifying the MAC. And that's the code word. Again, this is 3 states. W is in a completely different state, all of its own. Okay, so now security of the MAC tells me that if at all W was modified, then it has to be the case that one of the key or the tag were modified, because otherwise you're not going to be able to forge a MAC tag. So that's great. But because Ka and T are modified, so basically certain components of the message of the non-malleable code were modified, which obviously means that all of the messages should have been modified, because otherwise you've got a relation. When you look at this non-malleable code, you manage to modify it in a related way. What is the relation? You basically changed 2 components but kept 1 component the same. So you should not be able to do it, right? So if the key and the tag were modified, then S also has to be modified, and we know that it was modified to something independent because of NMC security. And we essentially solved the main bottleneck which we had, which is that if W is modified, we have a guarantee that S is also modified. So this is the high level security. I'm not going to go into details, but essentially it involves understanding exactly what securities your extractors give you and leveraging those while combining it with other notions like MACs and tag, NMCs and so on. Okay, so what I've shown you is a 3-state non-malleable randomness encoder. We could combine W with one of the 2 states L and R and actually still argue security. For that, we'll need a stronger property from the underlying non-malleable code called augmented security. I'm not going to go into it. But anyway, so far we've seen a 3-state NMRE construction which can be made 2 states, and also this can be applied to build constant rate 3-state NMCs. So far, which was not known until now. And as I said, this second result was also independently discovered by Gupta, Maggi and Wang. Okay, so they don't go via the NMRE route, they have a direct construction. The actual construction of their NMC and our NMC is the same. The NMRE analysis is ours. Okay. So in the very little time that I have, let me just give you a flavor of this, a very cool area called privacy amplification, and tell you a little bit about the connection of non-malleable codes to privacy amplification. Okay, so what is privacy amplification? It was a problem that was introduced by Bennett, Prasad and Robert in '88. You have 2 parties, Alice and Bob, who share a non-uniform secret, again something that has entropy, and their goal is to agree on a uniformly random secret key K, while communicating in the presence of a potentially active adversary. The original problem was defined with respect to passive adversaries. And your goal is to come up with a key that's as long as you possibly can, right? So you'd like to achieve the goal while minimizing the entropy requirement. So you can assume that W has full entropy and then there's nothing interesting to solve. So ideally you'd like to assume as little as possible about the entropy that you're starting with, and you'd also like to do this. Sorry, let me actually define this term called entropy loss. So while communicating in the protocol, you're going to lose some amount, the adversary is going to gain some information about W. So this information is something that you want to minimize as well. And we'll call this the entropy loss. So you want to achieve privacy amplification with the lowest possible entropy loss. And secondly, you also want to minimize the round complexity. So you want to do it in as few rounds as possible. Okay, so let me tell you very quickly one construction of privacy amplification in the passive setting. So if you want to work in the passive setting, you can simply use randomness extractors, because the adversary can, Alice can pick a seed S and send it across to Bob, and you can just use it to extract a shared key K, and you know, because it's a strong extractor, that you've not really learned any information. And this has the lowest possible round complexity, 1 round, and the entropy loss is really low. You just lose security parameter number of bits. Min entropy requirement is also low. All of this follows directly because you know how to build very nice, cool randomness extractors. And in the passive setting, it turns out that you cannot have a 1 round construction, and the best possible is a 2 round construction. And you want to build a 2 round privacy amplification protocol where the min entropy is linear. Min entropy requirement is just linear in the security parameter, and the entropy loss is also linear in the security parameter. And all previous solutions on privacy amplification obtained one of the two. They either got the best possible entropy loss, or they got the best possible round complexity, and somehow it was important to combine both, and that was a bit elusive. So recently we have a transformation that took non-malleable codes and gave a potential construction of a 8 round privacy amplification protocol. This essentially assumes some strong properties about non-malleable codes, which we know how to build, and it assumes some properties which we don't know how to get. But essentially this is sort of a proof of concept. We show that if you have very good non-malleable codes, then here is a way to build constant round privacy amplification protocols with cool parameters. And this is joint work with Ishan Chattopadhyay. And it also provides very interesting connections of non-malleable codes to other primitives. So specifically, so far we've known constructions of non-malleable codes from 2-source non-malleable extractors, and we've known other connections to various flavors of non-malleable extractors like seeded non-malleable extractors, which I'm not going to get into. So this just provides a new connection from non-malleable codes to privacy amplification. I'd be happy to talk about all of this offline. Okay, so to summarize, we essentially discussed non-malleable codes, non-malleable randomness encoders, and their application to privacy amplification at a very high level. And we also saw construction of 2-state NMRE with constant rate. I think this area of information theoretic non-malleability in general is quite fascinating, but there's a lot to be done in the realm of information theoretic non-malleable codes and stuff, and especially in terms of finding new applications for them. On that note, thanks. We'll be happy to take questions.